Hey guys, Brad Gilmore here. Want to give a big shout out to our title sponsor, Walker Texas Lawyer. If you or a loved one have been injured in an accident, whether that be a car, truck, motorcycle accident, or some kind of other issue, hit up Walker Texas Lawyer at 713-552-1117 or walkertexaslawyer.com.
Oh, Brad, what have you done now?
Broadcasting live from Houston, Texas, and around the world. TV host, best-selling author, and radio personality Brad Gilmore brings you a collection of conversations with stars from movies.
Matthew McConaughey.
Brad Gilmore.
Mark Wahlberg.
Hey, how are you?
The legendary Mr. Christopher Lloyd. Christopher, how are we doing?
I'm doing good. Great introduction.
Television.
Jimmy Fallon joins us this morning. Jimmy, how you doing, my friend?
Good morning. Thank you so much, Brad, for having me. I appreciate this, bud.
Kelly Ripa.
Brad, thank you for having me.
Comedy.
Jay Leno joins us. Jay, how you doing?
Hey, Brad, what's going on?
Chris Tucker is in the building. Chris Tucker, good morning to you.
Hey, Brad. Good morning to you. How are you?
Gabriel Fluffy Iglesias.
Good morning.
Music.
Lola Monroe.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
The legendary frontman of AC/DC, Brian Johnson, joins us right now. Brian, how you doing?
Good morning, Brad. What looking to talk to me, funny lad.
Grammy Award winner Maya joins us.
How are you?
And more. This is The Collection. Now your host, The Boat.
Brad Gilmore! Joining me right now on the line is a New York Times best-selling author, host of MSNBC's The ReidOut, and author of the brand new book, Medgar and Myrlie, Medgar Evers and the Love Story That Awakened America. Joy Reid joins us this morning. Joy, how are you?
I'm great, Brad. Thanks for having me on.
You know what? Thank you for writing this book, first and foremost, because when I was reading through it and trying to understand more about Medgar Evers and Myrlie Evers Williams and really what they meant to this country's history, I was so surprised by so much of their story that I was not aware of. For people listening right now who might not have heard the names or maybe heard them in passing, who were Medgar and Myrlie?
Well, Medgar Evers was the first field secretary for the NAACP in the state of Mississippi, which means it was his job to investigate lynchings of Black people, to sign African-American residents up for memberships in the NAACP, and to register them to vote, which was, of course, a very difficult job in 1950s and 60s Mississippi. And Myrlie Evers was his amazing wife, who he met when she was a 17-year-old college freshman, and he was a upperclassman football player just home from World War II as a veteran. And they married and had this tumultuous 11-year love story before he was assassinated in front of their home in 1963, on June 12, 1963.
You know, in the book, you write that Medgar Evers deserves a place alongside Malcolm X and Dr. King in our historical memory. Can you expound upon that? Why do you feel as though he is not covered to the extent that those other two names are?
Well, James Baldwin said it first. And, you know, I believe what James Baldwin said because I believe he was our greatest American writer. But he also knew all three men and knew what they had done for the movement. And, you know, I think it's really important to remember that all the things that Medgar did, he did in the most dangerous state to be Black in America, which was Mississippi, right, which had per capita the highest number of lynchings, the most vicious version of the Klan that was willing to even kill Northern boys like they did Emmett Till, and white people. So the Klan in Mississippi was on another level of viciousness. And, you know, I think one of the reasons that he doesn't rise to the level of Dr. King and Malcolm X is that their assassinations, Malcolm 2 years after Medgar, and then Dr. King 5 years after, and also the assassination of President Kennedy at the end of the year in 1963, plus the March on Washington, I think events just sort of overtook him and overtook his story because the violence just kept coming and coming. And so each story sort of overtook the last.
Did you feel that that's why you wanted to write this book and put Medgar and Myrlie's story out there to kind of shine a light back on this story?
I did, because I think that, we think about particularly in a time when, folks are trying to make, learning history illegal and taking books out of schools.
Right.
I think we have a limited understanding, even before the book bans, of our history in this country. And we tend to think about the civil rights movement as that one line people remember from Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. And people really don't generally know much else, or many of the other heroic people who participated in the movement and their wives. This was a story not of just Dr. King, who was an heroic figure in our history, but of a lot of people, many of whom, like Medgar, admired Dr. King and tried to replicate his movement in their state.
Yeah, and what's interesting, too, is when you think about it, you mentioned Mississippi and how difficult it was to even register people to vote, because it's not like it was in maybe northern states or other states in the South. The black residents in Mississippi were almost afraid for their lives, am I right, if they were trying to register to vote, because they were afraid of what the backlash might be from the Klan and other groups alike.
Right. Recall that, Fannie Lou Hamer was beaten nearly to death, thrown in jail and beaten for trying to register to vote. She was evicted from the plantation where she lived and worked for registering to vote. You could not only be fired from your job for trying to register, you could be lynched and killed, and many people were. Whites in Mississippi were determined that blacks, who after the Civil War actually outnumbered white people because the cotton industry demanded so much labor, that after the Civil War, blacks were actually a majority in Mississippi. So they essentially had to institute apartheid to make sure that black residents could not outvote them and choose governments of their liking, which they did for 12 years during Reconstruction. And the Klan and the backlash to that produced a great migration out of the South and out of Mississippi that rendered that majority a minority, but really a large minority. We're talking about 40 to 45% of that state still being black in the 1950s. And so suppressing that vote and not allowing the 15th Amendment to take effect was all that the white establishment was about, from the governor to the Sovereignty Commission, which was the state spy organization, to the White Citizens Council, to the Klan. It was an all-hands-on-deck effort to suppress the black community from participating in the system in any way.
And that's why I think the timing of this book is great, because those, it's the age-old cliche, right, Joy? Of those who aren't aware of history are doomed to repeat it. And I think to know more about the story and everything that you just shared there and that you share in the book is very important right now in our country. I want to ask you a question about the writing process and you writing this book, because it is such an important story, and because they have such historical significance, both Medgar and Myrlie. Did you feel like an overwhelming amount of pressure when writing this to do the story justice? And was it difficult sometimes to finish the book because you wanted to add more, or, maybe second guess yourself in certain aspects?
Oh, absolutely. And, it's funny that, I kept getting more interviews, for one thing, because, I would need another person that had been involved in the movement with Medgar. In fact, Joe Madison, the Black Eagle, a great radio host, was the last interview I did, because I discovered that it was he who actually inspired Myrlie Evers-Williams to eventually run for board chair of the national NAACP. And he was actually my last interview. And the interviews that, kept coming as I was trying to finish this manuscript actually pushed the release date into February, which turns out to be, of course, the love month,
Right.
in Black History Month. And so it was sort of auspicious that it happened that way. But I also felt a lot of pressure because Myrlie Evers-Williams is very much here and alive. Mm-hmm. She just turned 91 years old on March 17th. And I felt the pressure to do the right thing by her and by her two living children, Rena and Van Evers. And since they're here and they're in my life and they're, they can see what I'm doing, and I wanted them to love the book and feel that I had told their story accurately. And then all the people that we interviewed on the block where they, lived and where their best friends were, these were people who I felt accountable to, and also obviously to history itself, because it is something that we can see is not something that's guaranteed to us. It can be taken away, and we're seeing school boards try to do it. So I felt a huge responsibility to get it right.
Well, I'm sure you're relieved that you did get it right, and so many people have responded overwhelmingly positive praise for the book and the story that you told. One last question, because I only have you for another minute or so, but I did want to ask this, because when Medgar Evers was assassinated, Myrlie was, I believe, 33 years old, had young children. Her and Medgar were 7 years apart in age, and she had to kind of rebuild. What did you learn about her in those days after the assassination of her husband? Is there anything that you could point out as to that was why she was able to persevere through all of that and continue the journey?
You know, Miss Myrlie spoke a lot about the way she was raised by her grandmother and her aunt, and what they gave her, despite the fact that these were not rich people. They were teachers. They lived a very humble life in a segregated community, but they gave her poise and a sense of personal dignity. And that's what she was able to bring to the table. She was in a girls' singing group when she was young. That gave her performative ability. And just her ability to deal with this man who was 7 years her senior, who knew more about the world than she did, but to be in the fight with him and to be able to communicate with him and understand him and be his partner. She had all the tools that she needed to become really the first national civil rights widow, and the one who had to make the template for how future civil rights widows would have to deal with the national press, with Dan Rather at her door, with the world at her door, and not just her community. So Myrlie had all that she needed, and you can see just now in her dignity and grace that she still does.
Well, I love the time that we've gotten to share this morning. Great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on. Medgar and Myrlie, Medgar Evers, and the love story that awakened America by Joy Reid. Joy, thank you again so much. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me on.